So, welcome everybody. So, thank you for joining us for today's Faith Invest Forum. This is the second forum where we explore our insights from our latest research, Good Intentions 2026. So, my name is Catherine, and I'm delighted to be with you for what we think will be a genuinely useful and thought-provoking session. We're delighted to be joined today by Arjan Overville from Oikocredit, who will be joining us in the session a little bit later. Oikocredit is a sponsor of Good Intentions 2026, and we're very much grateful for their generous support. So before we dive in, a very brief word about who we are. Faith Invest is a UK-based charity that supports faith organizations all around the world to align their investments with their faith values. And we work across faith traditions and we work across geographies. So Good Intentions 2026, which we published and launched in April of this year, is our most ambitious research project to date. Last month, we held an official online launch of the report, and I'm happy to say that a recording of that launch is still available to view online. As part of Good Intentions 2026, we analysed 275 publicly available investment policies from faith organisations around the world. And we assessed each one of those policies against 10 criteria that together make up our faith-consistent investing framework. Our research, so the primary question that we asked in Good Intentions 2026 was, how well does the policy reflect the faith values of the organization that holds that policy? And Pippa is going to tell you a little bit more about how we scored those criterion in the chat. So today, for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to focus on 4 of those 10 criteria. So we're going to focus on criteria 1 right through to criteria 4. These are the criteria that form the foundation of any faith-consistent investing approach. And we look at what the data shows and what it means in practice. So the findings. The 4 criteria that we're looking at, they sit at the heart of any investment policy. So they cover what your policy says about your faith, what you won't invest in, what you want to support, and whether the funds that you use can actually deliver on those commitments. Just taking a little step back for a moment before we look at each of those criterion, what were some of the headline figure findings? And this is just a recap from our last session. So when we assessed all 275 policies, not a single policy reached what we phrase as outstanding alignment. This is the highest tier of faith alignment. Only 11% of policies had what we call a good foundation of faith-consistent investing. Half were making a basic or kind of a minimal effort. So there was something there in terms of steps, but there were also gaps. And around 39% of the policies that we assessed showed minimal faith alignment implementation. So basically very little faith consistent content in their investment policies at all. And that's quite a striking finding. As Good Intention shows, these gaps are not necessarily because of a lack of commitment or individual intent by an organization, but rather gaps that exist within the wider ecosystem that is needed to support the individual efforts of faith organizations. And of course, the good news is that all of this is fixable, and that's what this session is also about. So let me walk you through the 4 criteria that we're focusing on. Criteria number 1 is faith documentation. So criterion 1 asks the simple question: does your investment policy actually explain that you are a faith organization and what that means for how you invest? So, of course, you might think, well, yes, it does. We're a Catholic diocese or we're a Methodist foundation. That's obvious. But what the research found, so what we found in Good Intentions, is that naming your faith tradition and explaining how that tradition shapes investment decisions are two very different things. So, a significant number of policies contained minimal or no faith specific content at all. The policy could have been written by any secular organization. So, in other words, faith was often assumed, but it wasn't expressed or made explicit. Now, you might ask, why does this matter? Because if your investment policy doesn't explain how your faith shapes your investment decisions, then your trustees, your advisors, your fund managers have no clear mandate to work from. So, what can you do? Stronger faith documentation can require three things. And just to say, within our Good Intentions research, each chapter contains quite clear recommendations on how you can address some of the gaps that we identified. So there's very strong practical content that you can use within your organization. So stronger faith documentation can require three things: naming your faith tradition explicitly within your policy, stating the core principles that flow from that tradition, and explaining, even briefly, how these principles connect to your investment decisions. Many of the highest scoring organizations that we looked at in our research did exactly this in a paragraph or two. So just to add that the average score for criterion one across 275 organizations was 2.5 out of 5. And yet it is one of the most straightforward improvements that any organization can make. Criterion two, so this criterion looked at ethical exclusions. So we asked, what does your policy say you will not invest in and why? So this is the basic form of faith consistent investing. Faith communities have been saying, we won't put our money into that for decades. Weapons, tobacco, gambling, alcohol. And yet 29% of the organizations that we assessed had no exclusions at all in their investment policies. Not one sector was named. Among those that do have exclusions, quality varied considerably. So many policies list a sector. We don't invest in weapons, but then give no further detail. There is no revenue thresholds, no definition of what counts, no specification of whether this applies to equities, bonds, private assets. And without that detail, the advisor or the fund manager has no reliable way to implement those exclusions consistently. So the average score for criterion two was 2.1 out of 5. And just to add, exclusions set your moral floor. They are essential, but they are also the beginning of faith consistent investing, not necessarily the destination. So if your organization needs to strengthen this area, you may wish to identify a number of sectors, 2 or 3 sectors, for example, that your faith principles require you to avoid. Define them clearly, review them annually, and so on. So criterion 3 relates to positive screening. So if we ask the question, what does your investment policy say you actively want to support? So not just what to avoid, but what should your capital be directed towards? The areas where your tradition identifies as priorities for human flourishing, for example. Now, really interestingly, really striking, criterion 3 recorded the lowest average score of all the 10 criteria that we looked at. And that was just 1.6 out of 5. So more than half of all the organizations, 51%, scored 0 to 1. And 28% had absolutely no positive provisions in their policy whatsoever. So this is the gap that Faith Invest's founding president, Martin Palmer, captures when he challenges the sector. We know what you are against, but what are you for? And we know faith traditions are not short of vision, but very little of that vision makes it into the investment policy documents. A starting point might simply be name one or two investment priorities in your policy, signal that intention, and that alone will give your advisors something concrete to start working with. Criterion 4, we looked at investment vehicle selection. So criterion 4 asks, even if you have a strong investment policy with clear documentation, clear exclusions, clear positive priorities, can the investment funds and managers you are actually using deliver on those commitments? Because if not, your policy may just be aspirational rather than operational. So the average score for criterion 4 was 2.0 out of 5. So not one organization in our sample reached the highest tier. 35% scored 0 or 1. In many cases, organizations are using pooled investment funds that are simply not structured to apply faith-specific exclusions. The policy may say one thing, the portfolio may deliver something else. And that can be a constraint. But it doesn't mean that your values can't be reflected. It may mean that you need to ask your manager one direct question. Does this fund already apply the exclusions I care about? Does it offer any positive screening towards the things that my organization wants to support? And if not, are there pooled options that do? So for organizations in traditions that have their own investment bodies, the most straightforward fix is to prioritize those denominational vehicles first. For others, include values alignment as a formal criterion when selecting investment managers. Asking explicitly, can this fund implement our exclusions? Can this fund do our positive screening? And how will it report back to us on alignment, for example? So what is the central challenge that we identified from these 4 criterion in good intentions? What do these 4 criteria together tell us? So there are 3 gaps running through the data. So first is the positive investment gap. Many organizations are far clearer about what they don't want to invest in than what they want to support. Second, the implementation gap. So even well-written policies can fail at the point of delivery when the funds and managers chosen cannot or may not are not capable of implementing the commitments that the policy sets out. And then third, the capacity gap. Many organizations have the commitment, but not necessarily the tools, the confidence, the expertise, the knowledge, or the ecosystem support to act on it. And that's one of the big conclusions that we arrive at in Good Intentions 2026, is the need for that ecosystem support to enable all faith organizations to pursue their faith consistent investing journey. So it's not a failure of values or not necessarily a failure of individual intent or commitment. For many, it can be a resourcing and support challenge. And that is why organizations such as Faith Invest is here to help address. So I'm going to pause there for a moment before I turn to our executive chair, Dave Zellner, who is also a co-author of Good Intentions. We're going to pause for a poll. We have 3 polls running through this session. And this poll is for those of you that represent a faith organization. So Pippa has put up the questions. There's only 2. Which best describes your investment approach today? And question 2, how much does concern about financial returns shape your faith alignment decisions? Okay, I don't think I can see the responses. Okay, very interesting. So just under a third, 29%, clear on exclusions, less clear on what we want to actively support. 43% are working on both exclusions and positive investment. 14% rely on their advisors to handle, and 14% don't know. And then if we look at question 2, Okay, so for the highest percentage, 31% return concerns don't materially constrain our approach. 23% return concerns affect what we exclude and what we invest in. 23% also it limits our willingness to pursue positive or impact investments. 15% don't know, and then 8% limits how strict we are on exclusions. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it to Dave. As mentioned, Dave is Faith Invest Executive Chair and also a co-author on Good Intentions. So, Dave, faith traditions speak clearly about their values through general assemblies, general conferences, and similar governing bodies. They've formally adopted positions on how the commitments that are expected to guide how the tradition engages with the world, including how money is stewarded. I think the bigger question that Good Intentions examines is this: how should these values influence the investment decisions made by the organizations that are entrusted with the tradition's assets? And I think what we've found in Good Intentions is that there is a persistent disconnect between what a tradition has said that it stands for and where its associated investment bodies are actually putting capital. So I want to explore that gap a little bit more. Can you start, Dave, by describing what that gap actually looks like and where in the investment process does it tend to show up?
So, Catherine, you touched on that in your presentation, and it's basically the first is this tension between aspirations and implementation or delivery. Organizations, they're adopting strong ethical commitments at the policy level. But then the funds that they are invested in, and it was kind of reflected in some of the responses that you saw to the survey, um, those don't offer the flexibility to implement on those commitments. The policy says one thing, but then the vehicle that they select is not doing what the policy, what the aspiration is saying in the policy. So that's one of the gaps. Now, the second is in terms of professional guidance. We found that about four-fifths, 80% of the organizations, they don't require that their investment professionals demonstrate any expertise in faith consistent investing. They do require that their advisors have sophisticated financial credentials, but then they assume that values implementation will somehow happen on its own. And then the third is in monitoring. We found that the organizations have good, sound, solid financial monitoring that's established. They've got the quarterly performance reviews, they've got benchmarking, they've got that usual rigor. But we didn't find many organizations that actually apply that same discipline in verifying that their investment portfolio is reflecting what the tradition stands for. So the
Mm,
gap isn't really at the front end where they're
mm,
stating their values and what those values represent. It's more downstream at the point where
mm.
the policy is supposed to become practice.
Yeah, so I want to ask you, like, why does this gap matter? And what's really at stake when a faith tradition's stated values and its investment practice don't really line up?
Yeah, you're right. Integrity is the obvious answer, and it does matter. Faith
Mm,
organizations reflect a certain moral authority, and that authority depends on authenticity
mm,
between what you say and what you do. But the consequences go further than that. The first is that the asset owner may actually be investing in ways that are working against their tradition's mission. So
mm,
if a denomination has formally adopted positions, say, on environmental stewardship or care for the vulnerable, and the institution holding that tradition's assets is invested in companies whose practices contradict those positions, then the organization isn't just falling short, it's actually funding things that are contrary to their tradition's belief.
mm, mm,
The
mm,
second is missed opportunity. Faith-based organizations, they collectively steward meaningful financial resources. And the potential to direct that capital towards outcomes the tradition genuinely cares about is significant.
mm,
But the report shows that the potential remains
mm,
only partially realized.
mm,
And then the third and perhaps the most uncomfortable outcome is the erosion of trust between the
mm,
tradition and the asset owning institutions. So
mm,
when members of a faith community see a meaningful gap, so the stakeholders, when they see
mm,
a gap between what their general assembly or their general conference has affirmed formally and
mm,
how their investment body is actually behaving,
mm,
that legitimacy of the institution comes into question, not
mm,
just the financial decisions. The
mm,
reputation of the institution is at risk of undermining
mm,
it's the mission of the organization.
mm.
So integrity, yes, but
Yeah.
also alignment of capital with the values expressed in the owner's mission, the
Mm,
realization of significant influence, and the credibility of the
mm,
institution within its own community.
hmm. Thanks, Dave. So one of the most striking findings from Good Intentions is that faith-based investors are stronger at avoiding harm than at pursuing positive impact. Why has the field developed this way, and what does it suggest faith investors should be asking themselves at this point in time?
Yeah, there's a historical reason, and then there's a structural reason for this. Now, the historical reason is that faith consistent investing largely grew out of exclusion. The earliest expressions of value based investing in the faith community were about saying no. No to tobacco, no to weapons, no to apartheid South Africa. That's how the field defined itself for decades. So organizations focused on avoidance long before they developed any interest in affirmation. Now, the structural reason is harder. Exclusions are simply easier. They're
Mm,
rules based, they can be defended,
mm,
they are simple to monitor, and they don't actively require you to go find something.
mm,
Positive investment, however, requires you identify what you're investing for and to
mm,
source investment vehicles that actually deliver on that. And
mm,
often to accept that the universe of available products is narrower.
mm,
Now, there's also this persistent myth, and I want to be clear, it is a myth that pursuing positive impact comes with a financial penalty. The
mm,
evidence simply doesn't support that, but that assumption still is shaping decisions.
mm,
So, what should faith investors be asking themselves?
mm,
Two things. One, is what we don't invest in really the limit of our witness as a faith-based investor?
mm,
And second, if our tradition has formally stated positions of the kind of world we want to help build, care
mm,
for creation, dignity of work, support for the marginalized, what does it mean for deploying capital to achieve those outcomes?
mm,
The question isn't whether positive investment is possible, it's
mm,
whether not pursuing positive investment is really consistent with what the
mm,
tradition has said it stands for.
mm. Thanks so much, Dave. Just one final question. So if I'm a trustee listening today and I'm thinking, I'm not actually sure how strong our investment policy is, whether our investments reflect our values as well as we assume, or whether our capital is actively supporting what matters to us. Where should we start? So what are the first practical steps organizations can take to assess where they are now and to strengthen implementation?
So, for those that are on the call that are trustees or have the ear of trustees, I would suggest that there are 5 steps that you can take. First, you want to go back to the source. You want to look at what your tradition's governing body has formally adopted. The General Assembly resolutions, the encyclicals, the conference statements, whatever your tradition's authoritative form is, those are your values. You got to get them in front of you. and educate your trustees on what those values are because I'm sure those of you that deal with trustees, especially new trustees, are surprised when they understand what the General Assembly or the General Synod is saying about certain issues. They don't know that they even exist. Second, you take your current investment policy and put it next to what the positions of the General Assembly or General Synod, or whatever the overall organizing structure of your faith is, and look at where they align with what the faith is saying. And then where is the policy silent? And where are there contradictions? And you'll often find that the policy reflects values aspirationally, but it doesn't say what's actually expected of the portfolio. And then, third, you want to run what we'll call an integration audit. Just ask honestly, what proportion of the assets that you have truly reflect what your tradition has said matters? And you may be pleasantly surprised, or you may not. Either way, you'll know. And then, fourth, have a direct conversation with your advisor, the folks that manage your money. Tell them what you expect. Ask them to be clear on what they can deliver, and then document the gap between the two. And then that gap represents your work plan. And then finally, fifth, don't do it alone. You don't have to do it alone. There are denominational networks, there are peer organizations, there are ecosystems.
Mm,
Faith Invest is included among them,
mm,
whose entire purpose is to help your organization through exactly doing this type of work.
mm,
The organizations in our study that scored well almost always had access to shared infrastructure,
mm,
and you don't have to build everything from scratch.
mm,
One final thought. This is a journey. It's not a
mm,
one-time exercise. The
mm,
strongest organizations we saw treat faith consistent investing as an evolving practice,
mm,
reviewed, refined, updated as the tradition itself evolves, and every
mm,
faith is evolving,
mm,
and new ethical questions continually emerge.
mm, mm,
AI being the most recent example.
mm. Excellent. Thank you so much, Dave. Now we're going to turn to our second poll of the session, and this poll is just for our investment professionals in the audience, and we only have two questions. So, when a faith-based organization engages you to implement a faith-aligned strategy, what do you most often find missing in their investment policy? Okay, there's five options there, response options. And then question two, what would most strengthen your ability to deliver faith-consistent outcomes for clients? So we'll just take a moment, see if we get our results up on the screen. Okay, really interesting. So 40% values are stated but not translated into clear instructions. And then around a fifth of you, 20%, measurable criteria for assessing faith alignment, clear objectives for positive investment beyond exclusion. Okay, really interesting. We have a look at two. So, what would most strengthen your ability to deliver outcomes? So, frameworks that help your clients translate values into operational policy. That's 40% of you. Okay, 20% independent policy assessments, better aligned products and vehicles, 20%. Okay, thank you. Fantastic. So I'm conscious of time, and I'm now turning to Arjan Overveal. We are delighted to welcome Oiko Credit. Oiko Credit is one of the sponsors of Good Intentions 2026. Oiko Credit is a global cooperative and one of the world's largest social impact investors with over 50 years of experience working alongside faith organizations. Arjan is the senior relationship manager at Oiko Credit. So welcome, Arjan.
Thank
I've
you.
been so Credit works as a practical example of how faith-based investors can think more intentionally about directing capital towards positive outcomes. And I think Credit would be of particular interest to those of you amongst us in the room who wish to perhaps prioritize impact over returns. So, Arjan, many of the organizations joining us today may be asking, what does positive investment actually look like in practice? Credit has worked with faith-based investors for many years. So, how would you describe the role positive investment can play within a faith-consistent investment approach?
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. And also thank you for the invitation to be here with you. And I also want to commend you on the Good Intentions publication. It's really an impressive piece of work, and also find it very insightful. By the way, for the audience, I'm Dutch, so that explains my accent and also my bluntness, but I'll try to restrain myself in that sense. Yeah, Credit was founded 50 years ago by the World Council of Churches, and actually it was interesting to it's interesting to see that um, they were founded on the one hand also to avoid harm. So basically, churches encouraged the World Council of Churches to create a vehicle that would not support war or the apartheid regime in South Africa, as Dave already mentioned, referred to earlier. But then the question came up, okay, how can our investments actually reflect our values and how can we make a positive change? So they set out on a journey to find projects that they could fund that would have a positive impact. So in 1978, Microcredit disbursed its first loan to a medical college in India, medical college and hospital, just to build housing for their low income staff. But to give a more recent example, I visited Costa Rica 2 years ago to visit some projects that I could credit funds. I visited a remote village, and there was a community of like 250 people, and they formed their own credit cooperative, and the credit cooperative was funded by a partner organization that I could credit works with. And it was really impressive to see what this credit committee did for their community. So they would just disburse small loans to people so that they could start a business or that they could improve their business or improve their houses. And they would reinvest the profits of the credit cooperative in the community, so to improve the community infrastructure or to sponsor sport events or things like that. So if you're seeking really to create positive impact, I think you should really have the communities and people in mind that you really want to support. And yeah, at Oiko Credit, we really believe that it's important to enable people to improve their lives on their own terms, but we just want to, yeah, enable.
And just to follow on from that, so from your experience, what tends to stop faith-based investors moving further towards intentional positive investing? So is it concerns over returns? Is it about kind of misunderstanding around impact? Are there issues around governance, perhaps? So
Mm.
what kind of tends to stop investors moving?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's also a group of faith-based investors that's actually moving forward in the right direction. And so they for example they select certain funds. In Europe we have the sustainable finance disclosure regulation in place. So we have so-called Article 8 funds, which are light green, and Article 9 funds, which are dark green. And I do see that faith-based organizations select those funds specifically. Those funds, for example, focus on selecting companies that are CO2 extensive, or they're using their resources very efficiently. But then on the other hand, there's also a group that is indeed not moving in the right direction, I would say. And for some reason, for some organizations, it's just very practical. They don't have the time or the resources to develop a clear strategy, and sometimes they're also not convinced, I think, that that they can actually do good with their investments. So I think there we need a little bit more education. And in terms of returns, I think that as they've already mentioned, nowadays most organizations are convinced that they can both create impact and get a good financial return. So yeah, also if you look at the global impact investor network, they also surveyed their members, and 75% says, well, we strive for market rate returns. So yeah, there's definitely plenty of opportunity to invest in good stuff and also get a good return.
So, how do organizations investing with Oiko Credit tend to think about balancing impact, values, and financial objectives?
We have a very diverse base of investors. So we have around 45,000 investors and we manage around 1 billion euros. We have both, we have churches as investors, but also professional investors and individuals. If you look at the faith-based organizations, they usually are very excited about the impact that Oiko Credit creates. And so we can share very tangible impact stories. We can tell them how many people we reached, how many people we helped to get access to renewable energy, for example. So they really like that impact. They like the values of Open Credit, which are quite similar to theirs. Yeah, one sister that joined me on the trip to Costa Rica even remarked that our congregation is aging and sisters are retiring, but we can continue our mission to serve the poor through our investment in Oiko Credit. So I think that's a very, very powerful testimony, right, of how faith-based investors are attracted to the impact we create. But then I also want to acknowledge, of course, that investors have financial targets, and if you invest in Oiko Credit, it's not so much about financial returns, but about the impact. And then it really depends per organization what the outcome is. So some faith-based organizations allocate like 0.1% of their capital with like a credit, but some smaller churches even allocate 100% of their assets with like a credit. So even though they all value the impact, they make a different different trade-off. Yeah.
So just a final question. So just very briefly for the organizations that are here with us today that are listening and that have focused mainly on exclusion so far, what is the one practical step that you think that they could take to begin exploring positive investment?
Yeah, I think it's important to start small. You don't have to change your whole portfolio overnight, of course, but maybe just carve out 1 or 2% of your portfolio that you really want to dedicate to creating positive impact. As a starting point, maybe the SDGs could be helpful, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and then not only the goals on the higher level, but also the underlying targets. Yeah, there are 170 targets, and maybe you can select 5 of them that you really want your investments to contribute to a positive outcome towards those targets. And then you use that small part of your portfolio as a sort of a test case, a pilot case, right? Where you really learn by doing. And I think you also should, if you work with a wealth manager or investment manager, you should really maybe start a conversation about the impact that the investments are generating and what concrete examples the investment manager can give. And maybe they can give you numbers, but maybe it's also good to ask for concrete examples of how the investment is contributing towards your mission.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Arjan. I'm conscious of time. We only have around 5, 6 minutes remaining, and I do want to get to some of the questions if there are any in the chat. So I'm just going to have a quick look. I see Sister Hilda. I perceive that positive investment is seen as something for the advanced faith-consistent investors. What would you say to beginners who are concerned about returns? Dave, do you want to take that for me?
I think Arjan just answered that question in his last response. I think you talk to your investment advisor. I would expect that you would have funds with an investment advisor. Talk to the investment advisor, ask them to demonstrate how companies in their portfolio have a positive impact and provide product and services and have business policies and practices that are consistent with your faith values in terms of having a positive impact. You may not have the type of resources, both in terms of staff or financial, like the more sophisticated, advanced faith investors, but you are using an asset manager, and the asset manager can provide the insight as to the extent to which their investments are having a positive impact.
Thank you. I just want to make sure. I have a question for faith investors. Anyone use, sorry, it's difficult to see the questions at the same time, so apologies. There is a question, I think, for the general audience. Does anyone use faith benchmarks such as MSCI's Catholic Values Index? Feel free to respond. So, how can we get data comparing returns on traditional investments compared to returns on investments with positive impact? That's from Richard. David or Arjan, are you able to take that?
So, Catherine, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, apologies. So this is a question from Richard. How can we get data comparing returns on traditional investments compared to returns on investments with positive impact?
Yeah, that's difficult because it's easy to get returns on traditional investments because you have indexes. Unless Arjun knows of any indexes that are available for positive impact investments, I don't know of any. It's difficult to get that type of information. And usually the positive investments are typically not publicly traded securities. So, for example, you can't get a quote on what well, I guess I'll just turn to you, Arjan. Are there databases of returns for microfinance lending organizations that one can look to get that information?
Not that I'm aware of, but I do know that the Gin did some research on the at least among their network of how the how impact investors performed. And well, they tend to report that that they can do as well as traditional investments. I'll put a link in the chat if you want to learn.
So yeah, the GIN is the Global Impact Investment Network. For those of you that have an interest, you can go to their website and take a look. But what we'll do is we'll follow up to see if there are any databases that have that type of information. I'm not aware of any, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist.
Okay, thank you. We're quickly running out of time, unfortunately. So apologies if I haven't managed to capture all of the comments, all of the questions in the chat. After this session, we circulate a recording of the forum and we will try to answer some of the questions that have been addressed. Just in terms of wrap up, we do want to run a final poll. So again, this is for two sets of audiences in the room. Question one on that poll. So that is just for those of you, again, that are representing our faith-based organizations. What type of support from Faith Invest would be most beneficial, most valuable to you? Multiple choice, so feel free to select all. And if you are working within the investment sector, question two is for you. If Faith Invest offered tools and services to support your work with faith-based clients, what would be most valuable to your practice? And again, multiple choice. Okay, we probably ran out of time. The results should come up on the screen one moment and you can review. Yeah, there they are. Okay, so just very quickly, 60% examples of policy language we can adapt, 40% an assessment of our policy against the good intentions framework. And then for our investment service, 57% a library of model policy language. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so just in terms of wrap up, if anything in today's conversation has made you wonder about your own organization's investment policy, you can get an assessment through Faith Invest. It's something we provide for free and in confidence for faith-based organizations. So we evaluate your policy against all the 10 criteria that we looked at in good intentions, and we then give you a clear roadmap for strengthening that policy. The QR code on the screen will take you directly to the section on our website where there's more information about our IP&G assessment service. So just very briefly then, before I let you go, a few things. So today is the second in a series of forums this year in good intentions. In July, so a month from now, we will be looking at governance, expertise, and professional oversight. So how faith organizations ensure that their investment committees and their advisors are equipped to deliver on their values. And the details for that forum are on the slide, and Pippa is very kindly going to put a registration link in the chat. Um, we're also planning a very special Faith Invest forum on faith and AI as artificial intelligence, where we plan to bring together key faith voices on the topic, and of course, set against the background of the recently published encyclical on the topic from Pope Leo. This will take place in late July, I think the 23rd. So please join us for both of those sessions. The registration links are in the chat, or you can find out more by visiting faithinvest.org forward slash events. So finally, thank you to Dave Zellner, thank you to Arjan from Oikocredit for such a thoughtful and generous conversation. And of course, thank you all for being here and sharing your time with us. And we look forward to seeing you in July.